To you who are listening, greeting. The time has come to continue our talk of Bicknoller in 1910 and of looking before and after. And to do so, we shall set off on a perambulation of the outlying parts of the parish. We've got to go along Trennell Lane, and the best way of getting there is to cut up through the churchyard, and we can notice a few things on our way. First, one of our treasured antiques. Away by the yew tree on the right, you see the stocks. That they were where wrongdoers were literally caught by the leg to be exhibited to public ridicule and abuse. Their position in 1910 was a bit nearer to the porch than it is today, for they were moved some years ago. They might have been originally on the village green, but I think it more likely that they were close to the church porch, as was customary, so that the good folk making their way to church had the chance to deride and pelt them in body before going into church to pray earnestly that they might turn from their wickedness and be forgiven in soul. Unchristian maybe, but not so barbarous as the pillory, for prisoners in the stocks were at least able to sit down, and they had their hands free to shield their faces against the volley of filth which would be flung at them. Now, as we walk on up towards the top gate, take a look at that long lane of white marble crosses, almost like soldiers drawn up on parade, all memorials to members of the Bickham family who used to farm Wayfield, and note the ages at which they died. Right in the corner by the Victoria Gate there is a high-walled enclosure with a little shed in it. In 1910, and for at least 50 years after, it was used for storing coke for the church heating boiler, but it is reputed to have been the pound where straying animals were impounded. I have heard a similar claim on behalf of the little walled garden in front of Darches, or Dorcas Cottage as it's called now, but I think the churchyard gate claim is by far the more tenable. In a map of 1839, the land opposite Darches is shown as open ground, but a map of 1888 does show it as a walled enclosure. It looks then as though the wall was built between 1839 and 1888, very probably, I would guess, after the school was erected in 1863. Now, a pound would be far more ancient than that, and also with some connection with the church, in that the church wardens in those days were the civil guardians and overseers of secular affairs as well as church. Well, actually, our next stop is going to be by that little walled garden, for we are on our way to the school. In 1910, where we are in fancy, we would have found it in use as such. Well, here we are then with the building in front of us, a fine building, now in part the post office, but it was originally the village school, and a date in the high up in the eastern wall shows the date of its building, 1863. Of course, it was a church school, built before state education came into being under the Great Act of 1870. The records show that it had a capacity for 57 children, and the average daily attendance was at the beginning of this century 29. They dwindled, and the school as such was closed in 1912 or 1913. I'm not quite sure, but it was one of those 2 years. However, for many years afterwards, in fact until our village hall was built in 1954, the school survived in construction and use, a place set apart for the deliberations and the orations of the village Hamdens and the local Pims, and the sound of revelry by night. Indeed, it was on with the dance, Though the flying feet were restricted in space, the joy was unconfined. The school was built on what used to be the village green, an asset needed by almost every village. In Bicknoller it was a triangular piece of land having its base on the bank of a stream and its apex opposite the entrance door of the house which now belongs to Colonel and Mrs. Forber. Here the children would shout at play, and the old men would sit in the sun on crude wooden seats and smoke and ruminate, or drowse and dream dreams. Here the young men and maidens would whisper together in the twilight and see visions. Here, too, stood that essential social service of rural life in a less exacting age, the village pump. Some of us can well remember it, standing in the forsaken school playground, a forlorn figure, akin to that sad little orphan, the last rose of summer, the lonely survivor of the days of its youth and the days of its glory. So it stood until some 20 or so years ago. Fortunately, the school, after it was sold off, was very well adapted, for the original walls of Quantock stone are preserved, as also is the roof, but with the addition of dormer windows. And there used to be at the east end a school bell hung in a little turret. I think that bell last sounded on Hogmanay night of 1954, but the owners tell me that it is held in loving care and may very well be seen again one day, and perhaps heard one day or one night. You never can tell. Well, now we will be on our way, and we walk towards Trendle Lane Hill. But before we get to Warscott, the sight of the churchyard gate reminds me that there was something I didn't tell you as we passed through it. You may have noticed the preaching cross, the old cross. The cross at the top is obviously much newer than the shaft, which is very ancient. The explanation is that the cross had been knocked off, I expect, in the Puritan days, and the shaft remained, and a cross was put on top of the shaft as part of our memorial to those who fell in the 1914-18 war. It looks rather odd because it is skew with. The shaft, you see, was emulating the famous tower in Pisa, but the architect or surveyor who planned it had the cross put on perpendicular. I suppose there's some professional reason for that. I should have thought it might have looked better if the cross had been in direct continuation of the shaft, even though it was leaning. But there it is, we can't alter it now. Well, now on our right, enclosed by walls, we come to what used to be one of the chief farms in the parish, Wars, so called presumably at one time because a War was the copyholder. The Wars were a titled family who lived at Hestercombe, near Kingston St Mary. After the Wars, Hestercombe was for many years the country seat of Lord Portman, but like so many great mansions, it ceased to be a residence some long time ago, and it became, and it still is, the headquarters of the county firefighting service. Throughout the greater part of last century, War's farm of Bicknoller belonged to the Lethbridges. They were also a titled family whose seat was Sandhill Park, which has been for so long a children's hospital. You may notice that the principal inn at Bishop's Lydeard is called the Lethbridge Arms. War's Bicknoller then passed to the Gimlet family. Whether it was by purchase or by marriage, I know not. The entrance to the farmhouse used to be through a gate opposite Loch's Marne, and then one went across a pathway which is shown on the plan exhibit number 1. the place where this entrance was has now been filled in to match the stone in the wall, but you can still see it if you look. The house was burnt down round about 1900, and the present house, named Warscote, was built. I am so glad that the Wars name was preserved, for it is a very ancient one. Now in 1910 the property was owned by Mr. William James Gimblett. He was the father of Percy Gimblett, who lived at Blake's for many years, and he also farmed the Wars farm land. The house had been sold off and the land retained. And as a matter of interest, sometime in the latter part of the last century, the Dean and Chapter, who owned both farms, of course, made a very extensive swap over between Wars and Wayfield. All the large fields on the left-hand side of Trendle Lane, from the outskirts of the present Wayfield to Quantock Moor, used to be part of Wars, but they were given to Wayfield. But Lady Furlong, Parsonage Close and Great Moor, which are all marked on the map, they used to be part of Wayfield, and they were given to Wars. In 1910, or very shortly after, a Mrs. Cuff lived in Warscott. There are three things I remember very clearly about her. First, that she used to go around without a hat, which in those days was distinctly unusual on the part of either sex. Secondly, she was always accompanied by two very vivacious little terriers. They weren't savage, but very lively, probably Jack Russells, I suppose. And third, she had a Jersey cow, which in what was then a stronghold of Devon Reds with maybe a bit of crossbreeding of Herefords, was as much out of place as an Hottentot in an Eskimo village. She didn't stay very long, and the house was purchased by a Mrs. Brandeth. She had been married twice, and of her first marriage she had two daughters, Vera and Clarice Pereroux, who lived at Warscote. I suppose today they'd be described as being with it. In those days they were distinctly ahead of it, for they shocked Mrs. Grundy by walking around the village smoking cigarettes. Now, I understood from remarks past that gypsy women smoked pipes along the roads, and that a lady was fully entitled to smoke a cigarette in the privacy of her boudoir, but not coram populo. Vera, who was the elder, married Harry Sweet Escott. Now, they had a brother who was evidently a pioneer in radio, for he had a twin-wired aerial running from the top of a chimney to a considerable height up one of the tall trees on the boundary adjoining Church Lane. They were then not so dense as they are today. Well, of course, I was intensely interested and intrigued. I'd never seen such a thing before, and I thought it might be a super Telfus pan, such as the little ones which were sometimes one of the sideshow amusements at the inevitable garden fete. On inquiry, I was told it was for picking up messages from ships. This left me bemused and bewildered as to how he could pick up messages from ships, why he wanted to pick up messages from ships, and what he could do with messages from ships if he picked them up. Now, the rude answer which regrettably might be given to a last question today was, I'm glad to say, not in use then. But there were two maxims very much applied. Little boys should be seen and not heard, and curiosity killed the cat. So I thought it wiser not to pursue the matter any further. In 1960,